And that way I can move and put this, otherwise this is going to get right in your way. Yeah, that'd be good. Okay, did you turn it on?
Can't tell.
Hopefully.
Hello?
Yeah, it's on.
It's on? Okay, we're on. That's a good start for this, isn't it? Okay, we're ready for our worldview class today, and I am really excited. In fact, I feel like as we're studying this worldview issue, how many feel like we're kind of having a lab experiment in the world around us for all these stories going on? So I've been doing some study this week on the materials that I asked you all to study, of course, to get ready for class. But I want to begin with a word of prayer, and then we're going to continue to talk about Islam. We're going to begin to move over to this issue of Marxism-Leninism. And as we do that, I want to let everybody know we're going to take a pass through these worldviews. Like I said last week, we're going to be hitting the dominant worldviews that are in the world today. We're going to lay a foundation, and then as we continue through the course of this year, you're going to get more and more skilled about recognizing these thought processes in the world around you. How many of you can already tell you're recognizing things better when you see the news? Are you getting to recognize things more? Okay, that's the purpose of the class. So I need Danae to pray for us, would you? Would you pray for us? Great.
God, I thank you for this class time that we have today, just to learn about your word, Lord God, and to learn about just the things that you've commanded us to do, Lord God, in this culture. I pray that this time would just prepare us and equip us for the world outside that we need to deal with every day. In Jesus' name,
amen. Okay, obviously the world is poised talking about the ISIS thing. In fact, I have this alternate press. What do I mean by alternate press? What do I mean by alternate press? You have the mainstream, they call the mainstream news. What would you say the mainstream news is in America? Name some of the mainstream news sources. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, ABC, CBS, NBC. Those are what you'd call the mainline news sources. And of course, we know that there are other news sources out there. In fact, there are news sources that would be called left-leaning or right-leaning news sources, meaning their ideologies. We're going to talk a little bit about that today as we get into the video that I had you watch last week. So, we've got people that have different viewpoints when they write their news. Does that make sense? Hey, that's kind of what this class is about, right? Would your personal worldview affect how you would report the news? Yes, no? Talk to me. How? How would it affect it?
Facial expression you use when you describe something.
Okay, your facial expressions when you describe something.
Interpretations.
Your what?
Interpretations.
Interpretations of the data. Yes. Okay. What else would it affect?
Maybe what you don't mention.
What you don't mention, or which stories you choose to cover. You could have, if you were coming from a Christian news source this week, then one of the big studies you covered was an event that happened in Houston. Anybody know what happened in Houston yesterday? Yes.
The mayor, who was a lesbian, had
A little bit louder because I
sorry, I missed my voice. The mayor had the pastors give their sermons over to the state so they could, or something like that, so
yes.
they could make sure nothing is being spoken out against homosexuality.
Right. There's a controversy regarding a law in the city and an ordinance they passed about gender-neutral bathrooms and people being able to use alternate bathrooms, and some pastors rose up and opposed that law, and now there's a lawsuit in which the pastors have been subpoenaed, meaning they have to hand over their sermons. Now, it's interesting. I checked my news sources yesterday because I mentioned that to somebody, and they said, well, I didn't see that on the news. Okay? You could definitely go to CNN or MSNBC or someplace like that, and you wouldn't have seen that on the news. Now, if you went to a Christian news source, what do you think the top feed story was? Okay? So you realize that even our media expression and which news channels you're listening to will either filter the news, highlight the news, or interpret the news for you. So this one is a pretty radical group. Not radical, meaning that they're right down thinking we got a big problem here. Big problem. Called WorldNet Daily. It's a news service, and this was a magazine that I subscribed to them. And so they say at the top here, the road to Armageddon, why the ancient war between Islam and the rest of the world is coming to a head. Now, that was interesting that I had this magazine come in this week when we were talking about Islam and talking about ISIS and talking about different people's perspective on what's going on with ISIS will be flavored by their worldview. Okay? Now I had you, last week, pull out your chart if you would, that we've been working on in this class. Because as we go through this year, and in fact probably even into the next year, we're going to continue to look at this very, very helpful chart that I believe can become a foundation for you as you head into your college years and you have to make sense out of what's going on in your classes. You have your chart with you? Go ahead and pull those out. If you're looking with us online, if you go to our syllabus and you go to the link on last week's, the first week of October, it told you to download from Summit Ministries what's called their worldview chart. You can just print this off for yourself and it becomes the backdrop that we'll be using in this class. So on here, we've been studying about Christianity, of course, and now we're over here at Islam, and we looked last week at these different branches of the viewpoints of Islam. Okay, now we got down to, I believe we got through sociology. What is the Islamic worldview viewpoint of sociology?
I need one of those.
You need one of those. Well, let's see if I still have another one, or whether we're going to need to make you a copy. What is the Islamic worldview of sociology on this chart? What does it help us to say there? Somebody just read it for me. What's it say?
Polygamy, mosque, Islamic State.
Okay, and so you have a view in here that polygamy is okay. Okay, the mosque and what's called the Islamic State. Now, somebody define for me what does the phrase Islamic State mean? We talked about that last week. Okay, caliphate is the expression of Islamic State taking on its ruling force in the world. So that's another word I ask you to learn. That's very good. Islamic State, and we hear it, you think of like the state of Nebraska or something like that. That's the confusing thing that many people think in the Western world is confusing us, because when you hear the phrase Islamic State, we're thinking country, we're thinking region, we're thinking we're going to set up a rulership. And so what's going on over in Iraq right now is a battle over who's going to control the land. Now, that's only one sense of it, because the belief of Islam, and what's the core book of Islam? The Quran. The core belief is that they are pushing to form Islamic State through the caliphate. Can you define that for me? Because I had you read that article about caliphate. What is the caliphate? You know? Who can define for me these words? Because see, they're foreign to me until recently. I didn't know these words. So, if you don't understand it, that's okay. Do you know what caliphate means?
I looked it up and it said
Good.
a position of leader or leading in the Islamic State.
It said, like, the successor Muhammad.
Just the
Something
leader
like that.
of the Islamic State.
He was the founder. So the concept of caliphate is that at some point, now listen to what this sounds like, okay? At some point, there will be a rise of power of the Islamic State in which it will have domination in the world, and in which through Islam you will see the head, the caliph, I believe is how most people pronounce it in the Western world, will rise to power and rule in the Islamic State. Hang on a minute. What's that kind of sound like to you guys? What's that?
One world government.
One world government. And in the Christian world, do we have anything that goes along with that? What do we call that in our Christian worldview, biblical worldview? How about Antichrist? The rise of Antichrist power in the Bible. So you have in the Christian worldview a concept that Jesus will one day come back and that there will be a one world government system corresponding to the Islamic world, in which they talk about this concept of caliph rising to power. So, when I picked up this little magazine that came in here, what they're trying to say, now, they're saying that they are credible, independent, and fearless. Well, I believe that they're teaching some things here, but I'm also smart enough to realize that everybody's got a viewpoint. I'm hoping that's one of the things you're going to learn in this class. Anytime you read, whether it's from an alternate press or from the main press, everybody say this with me, everybody has a worldview. Everybody has one. Everybody has one. So if I say I am totally not biased, I'm my own fool. Okay, that's ridiculous. We're all going to speak from our own view. But in this article, it was titled ISIS and the Apocalypse, and they were quoting in here that the prophetic rhetoric coupled with ISIS' claim to establish the first caliphate since the Ottoman Empire. Okay, you history buffs, when was the Ottoman Empire? Anybody studied that recently?
Didn't it fall like World War One? And it went like, it stayed for a really long
Ottoman
time.
Empire.
That would have been before that.
Was it?
So I think that's way back there, isn't there? Okay, somebody pull out your smartphone and figure that out. Does anybody have one? When was the Ottoman Empire? Because, we've seen Islam rise in power before in world history. So we need to guard ourselves to recognize this is not a totally new understanding because that's their worldview and they've pressed in different times in history and they've had success. It can be a powerful message, one that has already helped bolster ISIS popular support. The apocalyptic Islamic worldview is not limited to Sunni extremists. A large number of Muslims believe that the coming of this caliphate state, which was declared officially in June by this radical group called ISIS, many large number of Muslims believe that these events are imminent. In fact, in 2011-2012, a Pew survey, that's a research company, found that a high percentage of Muslims in the Middle East believed they would witness events leading to the Day of Judgment. In Iraq, where ISIS has recently expanded, 72% of respondents expect to experience the coming of the Mahdi, M-A-H-D-I. So isn't that interesting? So what we're watching here is a clash on the same stage. We have to recognize there's only one world, okay? There's only one God. So they're claiming that their God is now going to take power. Now, I'm teaching you from a biblical worldview. Is that correct, class? Is their God going to take power? Is he the true God? But is that demonic force going to attempt to set up power over the world? Yeah? So in one sense you can say you can have a false ruling idea and it's not a literal deity, but it is a force of darkness. Can you get that? Okay, somebody have, when was the Ottoman Empire? Did you have that for us?
1299 to 1335.
Okay, I thought we were way back there, 12 to 1300s. So we have seen, you read about the times of the conquest and the clash between Islam and Christianity. So that's a great place for history to take off in some of your studies. Now let's go over here, because the law system in Islam is something called, what kind of law? Sharia or Sharia law, okay? I've heard it pronounced both ways. We're going to call it Sharia law. Who can define for me what Sharia law is? Yes, go ahead, sir.
The moral code or religious law of Islam.
Okay, it's the law of Islam, okay? And in the belief system that Islam is the dominant world religion, and it is their job to force that upon anyone who's in the non-believing group. See, the Islamic worldview says that there is a group that is holy and right before God, and then there's all the rest of us. And so they believe that Sharia law should be imposed. It doesn't matter what government says what. Okay? It doesn't matter. It's independent of the government. That almost is foreign to my mindset. How about you? I have trouble with that because I can't. In my mind, I think like presidents, and I think constitutions. I think, okay, well, what's the law of the land? Sharia law is within their worldview system that it presses past the law systems of the land. And Sharia law is very specific. We looked last week at some of those images that Sharia law becomes what people who are practicing Islam in many communities want. Now, what's the appeal for some people, even in the Western world, to say, hey, let's go with Sharia law? What would be some of the appeal of that? We talked last week a little bit about that.
When do you really do wars with them?
Okay, it's very straight. Okay, you do this, you die. You do this, you die. So interesting, in an era where lawlessness, we've talked about that, where lawlessness is reigning, some people would say, hey, we want to get rid of all the bad stuff in the world. Because remember, if you look over here at the Islamic point of view, they have belief in a moral absolute. But they're going to use Sharia law to accomplish it. Okay? Now, what is the Christian belief in regard to law? Look right here on your chart. We believe there's a divine and a natural law, but the Sharia law supersedes man's laws. You see what I mean? Okay, now look over here under politics. Their worldview is something called Islamic theocracy. What does the word theocracy mean? Yes?
What, one God?
One God. Theo means God. Theocracy, ocracy is ruling. So one God ruling. So their political view, again, is different because we think in terms of an American political system. Republicans, Democrats, what's going on in Washington. We think in terms of that. The Islamic worldview is much more global. Okay? So the Islamic worldview transcends boundaries of nations. And they're looking to say, what does the global Islam want? That's the viewpoint of Islam. Can you see how that's a very different way of thinking? Can you see some dangers with that? Class, what do you think? What are some of the potential dangers of that world, of that thinking? What do you think?
Trying to take over the world.
Trying to take over the world is a pretty central danger. And the fact that if you say no to that system, it kind of makes you look like you're coming against somebody's religion. You see where, in the United States, we were founded on freedom of religion. Okay? Now, we also had a Christian heritage, so our understanding was that there was a Christian worldview down in the belief system of our nation. But in the Islamic worldview, we have to recognize there's not a recognition of the freedom. There's more of a recognition there's one Islamic state and you got to be in it. And that's what we feel some of this pressure in the world. Okay, now let's go over here to economics, stewardship of property. Notice how that's really the same view as what it says on this chart as a Christian worldview. That's why some people will say in some of these areas, what does it mean when we say we are stewards of our property?
We own
God's left us in charge.
God gave it to us, that all good things come from our Heavenly Father. We're here to steward over the earth. We're here to take charge of the things that are put in our dominion in order to watch over them, in order to be a good user of what God, because they're not ours, we're just here stewarding. So in essence, that one is similar. Now, under history, this is a big one. Under history is something down at the bottom, this word, what is this word down here? Called Jihad.
Jihad.
Jihad. Okay, now how's that for a loaded word? What is jihad?
A war.
Okay, when we think jihad, what do we think of? 9/11, the war. What war would you mean?
Involving us in Islam.
Okay, anytime when we see that violent expression, what do you think of when you think of jihad? The what?
Holy War.
A holy war. Okay. Now, this is where it can get tricky, and in a few weeks we're going to dip back in here and talk some more about Islam. So we're going to go back through this. We're getting the foundations out there, and then we're going to go a little deeper. But in the concept of jihad, you have different groups of Muslims that express the concept of jihad different ways. The most radical form we see in ISIS is the expression that anyone who's an infidel should be killed. Infidel meaning what? Non-believer, non-Islamic believer, that they should be killed. And so that's the expression we're seeing of the jihad view. Now, just this week, I read this interesting article that Lucas found and sent it over to me about Canada right now. Some of the Muslims in Canada wrote a kind of a training manual of how to live peacefully with Islam, and they were reflecting on jihad, the word jihad. And the interesting thing is they wrote this document, and the nation of Canada ended up rejecting it and did not use it in Canada. Because they said when you dug deeper, even though they were claiming that they didn't really believe in jihad, like warfare jihad, that it had an unrest and a violent tendency to the document. But the interesting thing is our State Department adopted that document and recommended it. And there's a lot of people right now that are very concerned. This is what you're picking up in the news. A lot of people are concerned that what we're trying to do in America right now is reinvent or rebrand Islam. You know what the term branding is? In the sense of the business world. What is branding? Do you know? You ever heard that phrase?
Yeah.
It drives the business world right now. What's branding? Do you know?
It's kind of like labeling something.
Yeah, it's labeling. It's okay. Who's got a shoe down here? Maybe that somebody have like that little check mark. Okay, a little check mark. If you see a little check mark on anything, does anybody have one of those on anything down here?
Was there not?
Lucas.
It's Not-
Okay,
not
okay,
really sure.
yeah, okay, so if you see a little check mark, what immediately do you say?
Nike.
Okay, how long did it take you to do that?
No,
I mean, like a second. I mean, not even like a split second. That's been one of the most successful labels or brands, and it produces an image. What's behind the Nike image? When I say Nike, what is the brand that they are? What do you think of? Sports, exercise. Okay, now let's be honest. When you see the Nike label, do you think of exercise the way I exercise, which is a middle-aged woman kind of walking through her front yard and exercising? No. What immediately do you see with that image?
Running.
Running and champions. Successful athletes, right? And so even the image, even though that's subliminal, I had to pull that out of you. You weren't aware of it, but you don't picture grandma in the front yard doing like little calisthenics when you see Nike. What do you picture? Victory! Yeah, take it. Go to the extreme. Just do it, right? What's their famous phrase? Just do it. What is that image?
A determined athlete.
Determined athlete, over the top, adventure. Okay, so when you buy Nike, that's supposed to be how you feel, right? You are buying that because you want that image in you. And so that's a case of branding. Now, did you know a company can choose to rebrand themselves? And in fact, we have a whole industry going on right now looking at what will move, particularly in our Western mindset that is very visual-oriented and soundbite-oriented. We get our ideas about things because of things like that little thing on his shoulder. Now, I might not have noticed that because that's a little bitty swoosh mark on the top of your St. Louis Cardinals thing. But the fact that that little swoosh mark was on there caused the price of that to do what? Just a basic, really long-sleeve t-shirt, okay? Nothing particular fancy about it, doesn't look like to me. But when you put that label on there, the value went way up. We're living in an era where people can take an image, remake it, and through mass media, reinvent themselves. So, let me just ask you this in a global way, because we're going to now go on to a new topic in a minute. If we want to understand Islam, how do we understand the worldview of Islam? This is a question, and I gave you a couple options with it. Do you understand Islam from the popular press, from the movies, from the opinion page, or from the Quran? Okay? Do you understand Islam from what's happened in the last 2 to 3 years, or do you understand Islam based on history? Interesting, isn't it? Isn't it? Okay, so in this study that we've been looking at here, and we're going to go deeper in it, but I'm going to go on to our next worldview because, again, we're getting these comparative worldviews out here. If we really want to understand Islam, we are our own fools if we think we can just look in today's newspaper and say who's saying what about what. Like the guy down the street is Islamic and he seems like a nice guy, therefore I'm going to let him define Islam for me. Say what? We do that. We know not to do that. We already learned not to do that with Christianity. Do we define Christianity based on what our friend down the road is telling us about Jesus? That would be silly. Do we define it based on how marketing is going on? So I want you to be watching as we're looking at this ISIS crisis. That's an interesting word.
Yeah.
The ISIS crisis. The ISIS crisis. The pressure from many who do not want to face this crisis is they don't want to look at this historically, and they don't want to look at the foundations of the belief system. So one of the big pressures right now is a video that I put on the Project 7000 website last week, where you have a guy saying, ISIS, that's not a problem. No, that's not a problem. That's just a local war over there. What do you think, we got a problem with ISIS over here? Can you imagine anybody saying that? I'm looking at it saying, you've been in the lab too long. I mean, you don't understand worldviews. Worldviews filter in, and of course, there are things going on here we don't understand. You guys get that? Okay. Now, how many of you think that it's probably wise for people today to understand a little bit more about Islam? Okay, how many of you are having an increased interest in it? I am. In fact, I've got a man from our church right now who has been studying on Islam for several years, and he's putting together some more materials for us. And so, since this crisis has come about, I had intended on us just doing Islam for a couple of weeks here, but I'm going to stop right there because he's really putting some good stuff together for us. We're going to put a pause in that. I want you to have that background so you can get into the comparison, but we're going to come back to it in a couple weeks, and I'm going to change our syllabus up to represent that, okay? Because this is like a real life class, okay? This is like the big deal. Because right now, we don't have, let me give you this too, we don't have to import a terrorist into America anymore. What do I mean by that?
Right.
We grow our own. We have the worldview intermingling in our culture so strongly that if it's true that the Quran will lead you toward jihad if you believe it, then it will explain why we can have a beheading of a woman in Oklahoma City with the man shouting Islamic phrases after the week before he'd been trying to convert people. Now, he was not from another country. In fact, he was a black man who had been in the prison system. So many people are saying, well, see, that's not terrorism. That's not terrorism. What do you think? That's just workplace violence. That's what we're calling it in America.
He killed in a commercial building or something?
Yeah, he killed her, he beheaded her. Because see, the Quran calls for beheading of infidels. So he beheaded her in his place of work. When he was fired, he had been fired because of trying to convert people to Islam. He came back in the building and shouted Islamic phrases and then ended up beheading this woman in Oklahoma City. So, right now, I just found a poll the last few days, overwhelming majority of Americans are claiming that was terrorism. We need to face it. As a nation, we need to understand that was related to this man's worldview. Okay? Now, but then we've got some people who are saying, no, you only have terrorism if somebody flies on a plane, comes over here and slams into a bomb kind of a situation. But what we're going to have to be smart enough to recognize is that these worldviews, when they infiltrate the thought process of men, you can have a nation taken from the inside out. Do you see what I mean? And so those who right now are studying this can look at it and say, folks, that's almost like an old-fashioned idea. You don't need somebody to hijack a plane to produce damage. But do you see why this is important? Most Americans are still they don't understand that. So it's a lot easier when you think about kind of the creepy idea that somebody could be a radical Islamic terrorist. What do you want to do? Not be near him and not think about it. I don't want to think about it. I'd rather think about fun things, pleasant things. But we need some people who will awaken and understand, right? Okay, now last week I asked you to watch a video because we're heading over to this next part of our chart called Marxism-Leninism. Okay, there are 4 men's names at the top of this chart. Read those for me. First we had Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Mao. Okay? Now, when I say Marxism-Leninism, what immediately comes to your mind? Communism, and you think Russia. Where do you think?
I was gonna say Russia.
China, North Korea. Okay, let me ask you this, true or false? We still have Marxism-Leninism in the world today. Okay? We still have a Cold War going on.
You'd have to define that.
There you go. Okay, what was the Cold War?
Yeah, Russia threatening nukes to us and we're threatening nukes on them.
Okay, it was the threat of conflict between primarily the United States and Russia, or a group of nations and Russia. And when do we talk about the Cold War in history? What era did it come about?
Nixon?
After World War II.
After World War II. After World War II, we had a period of a slow build-up. In fact, not too long ago, we were studying history in our home, and I put a trick question down to say, where was the Cold War fought? And so, one of the kids were like, oh no, I can't remember, I can't remember where it was fought, and I'm like, okay guys, listen, the Cold War was not a literal war where people were shooting and bombing. The Cold War was a period of history in which there was great concern about communism taking over and dominating the world. There was also something called the nuclear arms race, in which once World War II revealed that we had the bomb, then the opposing group, which at that point became Russia, began to build their own nuclear arms, and we were having a race. What was the race about?
You can get the uranium free.
Who can get the most bombs? Because the thought was, if you have more bombs, you have more power. If you have more power, then you're showing your domination. You can keep the other idea down. So we talk about nuclear arms race, but underneath all of that, which was, of course, a very dangerous thing, and we all wanted. When I was a kid, do you remember that, Susan? When I was a kid, I remember worrying about whether another bomb would be dropped, because
No,
You
I
don't
wasn't
remember?
exposed to that, really.
you weren't exposed. See, I was in a city where people were talking about it, and like, what about a nuclear bomb? So I remember thinking, okay, nuclear arms, they're a big deal. We don't talk much about that anymore. And we certainly, right now, a few weeks ago or a few months ago, we heard about Russia. What's been going on in Russia? Putin?
Yeah.
Heard Putin? P-U-T-I-N, the man that's the leader there, and what's going on about them trying to expand into Ukraine and take back charge. See, some of these things going on in the world, it's really about this issue of expanding an ideology. Now, is communism alive?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there a big, what you call, communist bloc conglomeration of nations?
Pretty spread out.
Yeah, kind of. It's not as obvious as what it used to be. Even though the ally situation is still very strong between North Korea and China and between Russia, and there's these areas. But there's been a time after the Berlin Wall came down where we quit talking about that, and the concern about communism went down. So let's look over here in this chart, Marxism-Leninism. If you're going to understand Marxism, the theology system of Marxism and Leninism is what?
Atheism.
Atheism. What's atheism?
There's no
There is no God. Okay? Now, skip over that just a minute. We're going to need to go over here and look at this link. Does anybody have their link with them on this, of that chart that we were looking at? I need to pull this up because we're going to need to define some of these words. Dialectical materialism, proletariat, morality. Do you guys know these words?
No.
Do you guys know them? Okay, well, let's pull up our chart. You remember that chart we were using last week? I meant to get the link here before we started. Let's see if I can get there. What was the name of the website we were on last week with this? Who can tell me?
Okay.
You got it right there?
All about worldview.org.
That's it, allaboutworldview.org. So that's what we're going to look at. And in fact, that's the one that if we don't understand these words we're looking at, which, I have to say, I don't understand all of these words. I learned them when I was in school, but when I try to recognize them, wow, my computer's not going here for me. Allaboutworldview.com. Who can find that for us? You got it? Okay, we're going to let you, since mine's not working right, we're going to let you define for us then, what is dialectical materialism? Dialectical materialism as a philosophy. What does that mean? Can you read it for us? How do they define it?
Alright.
Have to say it real loud.
Dialectical materialism.
Dialectical materialism.
That's the philosophy.
That's the philosophy of Marxism. Dialectical materialism. Okay, you have to read it real loud.
It's not like a...
Is it allaboutworldview.com
Yeah,
or .org?
It's a bunch of paragraphs.
Yeah,
Can you read all the paragraphs?
just read the first paragraph for us.
Alright. Frederick Engels delivers the core of Marxist philosophy. The real unity of the world consists in its materiality, and this is proved by a long and protracted development of philosophy and natural science. But if the question is raised, what then are thought and consciousness, and whence they come, it becomes apparent that they are products of the human brain, and that man himself is a product of nature which has been developed in and along with its environment.
Okay, now that's pretty philosophical, heady sort of stuff, right? But bottom line, the philosophy of a Marxist humanist worldview involved what? Give me just that last sentence you read there. The last sentence, which really teaches us what it's about. It's all related to what?
Which has been developed in and along with its environment.
The environment shifts based on the human brain. Did you read that in there?
Oh, yeah.
That it comes from the human brain. Because philosophy is that understanding of what man should be thinking. So the wisdom of the world is going to come from the human mind. Okay? That's going to be the philosophy. Now, there's this word that's called the proletariat morality. Anybody know what a proletariat is? Proletariat. Have you studied anything about Russia to be able to define that word? Who knows what a proletariat system is? You studied any of that? Okay, go ahead and read that one for us. Go for it. Okay.
Workers or working class people regarded collectively, often used with reference to Marxism.
Okay. It is the concept that there's going to be a working class of people, and the working class of people, everyone is going to hold equal power. So in a pure Marxist communist system, the working class is all kept at one level. One level. There's no system where one person is rising above the other. It's all kept at one level. Now, when we're studying Marxism and Leninism, remember we're looking at it from a worldview point of view. We're not looking at it to say, does it work? Okay? We're looking at it from a worldview point of view. Marxist-Leninism says that there is no God. It says that all people should be exactly the same. Exactly the same. That the philosophy will come from the mind of man. Now, tell me anything you know about communism as a government system. Because see, Marxism-Leninism is the worldview. Communism as a government system, will you see in history times where pure communism was able to be maintained?
For a very, very short amount of time. That's haywire.
Few days. Because really, when we look at it in history, we see a combination of communism and
Socialism?
socialism leads up to it, but communism will always combine in with somebody who gets charge over it. It'll be a dictatorial system. There'll be some sort of ruling group. The philosophy or the worldview is that you can have this group of people that we're all going to share everything in common, and that the working class, everything will be absolutely fair and everything will be held in common. Now, what we know in history is that that's never really happened, because somebody is going to end up capitalizing on it and become the dominant power. Okay, now we looked at this video last week, and this video was again one that we would have seen maybe you could call it kind of an alternate press video. Okay, when you watch this video, did you begin to understand wrestling with these ideas? Somebody give me the summary of this video we watched called Agenda. What was it about?
About how Marxists use what tactics they use to get their ideas into America without people realizing it was Marxist ideas.
So this video was produced a couple 3 years ago, and it started off with a quote from a communist leader that says, "America is like a healthy body, and its resistance is threefold. It's patriotism, it's morality, and it's spiritual life. If we can undermine these three areas, it will collapse from within." Now, somebody was operating with a worldview when they wrote that. Okay, that was a Marxist-Leninist sort of worldview statement. So what they were making a point is that the concepts of communism, now how many here know somebody who's a communist? Do you know somebody who's a communist? Like they walk around